Welcome to Pianokeys Academy. I'm Dr. Michael Finlay. One of the most frightening but ultimately transformative things that's ever happened to me as a pianist was when my teacher asked me to learn all 12 etudes of Opus 10 during my first semester at Peabody. I think what happened there is that I kind of arrived in a crumpled heap at my teacher Young Hee Moon's doorstep, and she just kind of shook her head, took pity on me, and decided I needed a serious kick in the pants. So this really did trick, and I really learned so much from that experience, and I'd like to pay it forward. So I'm excited to kick off this series of tutorials on all the etudes in Opus 10. My main goal here is to help you approach these pieces in a healthy, sustainable way so that you avoid injury, which is a real risk with some of these etudes, including, and perhaps especially the one we're talking about today, Opus 10, number 1. So in this video, I want to share 7 tips with you that really helped me with this etude. Before I list them though, I want to say there's one overarching goal in this etude that really should supersede all others, and that is to keep a small hand. This might seem counterintuitive given the nature of this etude, but it's absolutely essential. Chopin is begging you to stretch, but your job is to call his bluff. Here's why. Spread your fingers and wiggle them. Actually, even better. Put your other hand right here next to the elbow, kind of close to the pinky side, and spread your fingers. Do you feel the muscle contraction happening there? Now, hold your fingers close together and move them. It should be self-evident that spreading the fingers is the more tense position, and the reason is that it involves the muscles on top of your forearm and pulls these extensors, and it tightens the top of the forearm, severely impeding mobility. And then when you flex those fingers, the strain on the extensor tendons is compounded because the flexors are pulling against them. So that risks tendinitis. If you ever practice a piece like this and you notice that you get fatigue and pain on top of your forearm, it's probable that stretching is the cause. So avoid stretching, keep a small hand. Most of the tips today will have something to do with how to go about keeping a small hand. Tip number 1 is know the shape of your hand. Tip number 2, get off the thumb. Tip number 3, group to avoid stretches. Tip number 4, practice with quick, smart finger releases. Tip number 5, don't be a hero. Fingering changes are not a sign of weakness. Tip number 6, don't forget that you also have a left hand. And tip number 7 is practice the chorale. Tip number 1, know the shape of your hand. So a lot of teachers talk about things like arm circles or wrist circles. And with good reason. There are certain forearm movements that really help to assist the movements of the fingers. But it's really helpful to know why they work. And for that, let's examine the shape of the human hand. The thumb is the oddity. Its function is opposition. So it's offset further back on the hand, lower than the rest of the fingers. And it's rotated 90 degrees so that while the fingers flex up and down, the thumb flexes and extends sideways. So because of the big difference in length, function, and height, it feels different going from 1 to 2 than it does going, for example, from 5 to 4. When you're going from 1 to 2, the difference in length is so great that you need to come all the way off the piano. The thumb falls off the piano both because of the difference in length and the difference in height. So now the next finger to play is 3, which is also longer, so you can continue coming out for that. Then 4 and 5 are shorter, so you can start to come back in. Now coming down is different. It would feel unnatural to come back the way you came, or to imitate what you did on the way up from 1 to 2. If you try to come off the piano like this, it doesn't feel good because the difference in length is just not as great between 4 and 5, and they're in the same plane. Let's exaggerate. These fingers are at different lengths, but they make a nice round shape, almost like the spokes of a wheel, so you can just kind of roll over on them. So it feels better to go up and over in an arc shape when you go back down. So to summarize, going up is like a scoop, and coming down is like an arc. When you combine the scoop and the arc, it makes a circle. This is extremely relevant in this etude where the stretches are so formidable. So you want to scoop on the way up, an arc on the way down. And especially when the interval between 1 and 2 is very large, like in this arpeggio. It's what allows you not to stretch. Tip number 2 is very closely related, and that is to get off the thumb, both on the way up and down. If you feel pain practicing this etude, you probably either feel it here, as we already discussed, due to stretching, or here on the side of the wrist, and that would be due to twisting towards the pinky. That's because this etude is begging us to twist towards the little finger to accommodate the stretch between 1 and 2. Let's take that same large stretch between 1 and 2 in this arpeggio. If you try to connect these two, especially in this low octave where your hand is reaching across the body, look what that does to the hand. That poor hand is so twisted to the right that your ulnar nerve and tendons that pass through that area are severely compressed. If you compound the problem by repetitively moving your fingers, you risk both tendinitis and ulnar nerve compression, which is similar to carpal tunnel syndrome, except that it affects the ulnar nerve in fingers 5 and 4 instead of fingers 1, 2, and 3. So twisting is bad news. Instead, get off the thumb and play 2 towards the edge of the key. In this particular arpeggio, 4 and 5 are next to play. They're shorter. So you start to come back in, which brings the thumb back to the piano, and you come back out for 2. In, out, in, out, in. On the way down, get off the thumb rotationally. I sometimes practice with little triplets to practice this rotational movement. The rotation helps to clear the thumb off the piano and avoids that crowded feeling that you might feel going from 1 to 5 on a small interval. Like, for example, in this arpeggio, it's just a second between 1 and 5, so these 3 fingers might feel a little crowded unless you use rotation. Gets those fingers out of the way, and then it also gets the thumb off its key. So to practice that, sometimes I will practice with little triplets. Just kind of helps to promote that rotational movement and get the forearm more involved. And it helps clear the thumb out of the way and keep you from feeling crowded. So tip number 2, getting off the thumb by coming out on the way up and rotationally on the way down. Tip number 3, group to avoid stretches. For the vast majority of the arpeggios, I practice with the following grouping. So the thumb is kind of by itself, and the groups are from the second finger on the way up. And then there's a 5-note turnaround at the top, and the grouping is from the thumb on the way down. This is because the biggest stretch for most of the arpeggios is between 1 and 2. So we group to avoid that stretch and then throw the hand in between those groups. This grouping can be applied to the entire etude, and I often do go through the whole thing that way because it reinforces this idea of getting off the thumb. There are some cases, though, where the biggest stretch is somewhere else, like in this arpeggio. In that arpeggio, the biggest stretch is between 2 and 4. So it feels good to practice in a grouping that breaks up that stretch. So I'll group this way. The E major arpeggio has a biggest stretch between 3 and 5. So you can practice that one in this grouping. In every case, find the grouping by breaking up the biggest stretch in the arpeggio. When you go back to playing it evenly, think of throwing the hand in between the groups rather than trying to connect the groups. Tip number 4, practice with smart finger releases. Release each finger towards the next playing finger. That release should feel like the same movement that plays the following note. So in other words, you release to play. Like this. I release 1 off the piano, as we discussed, and then I release 2 towards 4. I release 4 towards 5. I release 5, and then that opens the hand and plays the thumb. Release the thumb by coming out for 2, and then the thumb comes closer to the hand. Release 2 towards 4, and release 4 towards 5, and then when you release 5, it opens the hand. Opening the hand helps to play the thumb, and it prepares the next arpeggio. So you release every finger towards the next finger, and there's like a sympathetic movement. When one comes up, the other wants to come down. Now, on the way down, release 5 towards 4, release 4 towards 2, release 2, opening the hand and helping to play the thumb. And each release feels like it contributes to the playing motion of the next finger. Tip number 5 is don't be a hero. Almost everybody changes at least one fingering in this etude. If the original fingering isn't working for your hand, I promise not to tell anyone if you change it. And I think you should. Ask yourself this: do you want to be a pianist or a purist? If I encountered this arpeggio anywhere else in the repertoire, there's no way in hell I would consider using this fingering. So since the point of an etude is to prepare you for the difficulties you might find in the repertoire, why would you approach it differently than any other piece? I think that we sort of get in our head that somehow diminishes us as pianists if we have to change any fingerings in an etude like this. And I just think that that is not the right attitude. So don't be a hero. At the end of the day, it's a piece of music, and you need to go with what sounds the best. The bass line is epic in this piece. It's so utterly important, so you need to know it backwards. Also, it's your base of support. As the right hand ascends and descends, your left hand stays planted. Your torso will need to be going back and forth to traverse the keyboard, especially since we begin so low and we want to avoid that twisting of the wrist. So it helps to kind of be between your hands, right? So the left hand helps anchor us as we move back and forth to accommodate this large compass. So you need to know the path of the left hand extremely well. This applies to all Chopin etudes, by the way. If there's something funky going on with your right hand, check your left hand. Chances are the problem is actually that you don't know that well enough. This might not seem as difficult as, for example, this. Opus 10 number 8. But nonetheless, knowing the left hand in any Chopin etude is very, very important. Tip number 7 is to practice the chorale. You need to know the chord progression intimately. Practice the chorale as though that were the entire piece. So you want to practice for beautiful voicing, beautiful voice leading, So practice for beautiful voicing, beautiful voice leading, phrasing, pedaling, sophistication, balance, all the things that make music beautiful. The more sophistication you're able to bring to this version of the piece, the more you will demand that those details make it into the final product. At the end of the day, this is what really makes for a brilliant performance of Opus 10 number 1. Of course we want speed, brilliance, evenness, accuracy, and all of those good things, but the magic of this etude are the magnificent harmonies, the gorgeous suspensions, and the expansive phrases that just wash over us. So those are my general tips for this etude. Now, as an added bonus, here's a sneak preview of my exclusive video lesson on the entire piece, every note, every twist, every turn. For the entire lesson, head over to my Patreon page. Enjoy this preview, and until next time, happy practicing. Okay, let's dive right in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the entire etude, and I'm mostly going to focus on the grouping, but I'm going to talk about other things that help as I get to some of the more difficult arpeggios. And so hopefully by the time I get to the end of the etude, working through it, you'll have a really good idea of different ways to practice it. I will provide you with my score with all of these fingerings and groupings written in, so you don't have to memorize all of this. Let's start with the first arpeggio. So the thumb is just a bus stop, and the grouping, let's see, where's the biggest stretch? It's between 1 and 2. So you break up that stretch between 1 and 2 by grouping from the second finger. Now I also come out for 2. And 4 and 5, especially 5, are shorter, so I come back in, which brings the thumb back to the piano. So there's a smooth in movement that brings the thumb back to the piano, and it also brings me in so I can come back out for 2. Be aligned on each finger. Take a look at the skeleton here. So each finger has 3 phalanges, that's this part, and what looks like an extension of the finger called the metacarpal. So I like to think of aligning the metacarpal behind the finger, one long finger that emanates from the wrist. Metacarpal, metacarpal, metacarpal. Let's look at that with a real hand. Come out for 2. I think about my metacarpal. And then again, behind 4. It's not a straight line with the key, by the way. It's a straight line with the forearm.